Today in our webinar, we'll cover about security for AI. I'm sure everybody is looking at how rapidly the AI is transforming the enterprise operations. Global regulators have started introducing multiple AI acts, from the EOA Act to sector-specific frameworks in US, Canada, Middle East, Asia, EU, Europe, UK. Now, what this also means that this has significant implications for how governance, risk, and compliance are managed. So with that being said, I would like to welcome you today to the chief guest and our Chief Technology Officer, Joy Bhomik, to you. A little bit about Joy before I hand it over and ask him to share his perspective. So Joy is one of the co-founders at Cygeniq. He's also the Chief Technology Officer with nearly over 2 decades of leadership in IT risk, cybersecurity, enterprise technology. He previously served as the Senior Vice President and Head of R&D at a leading product company and a very large global bank. And he led innovation in the product development and cybersecurity as well. So with that being said, Joy, I would like to welcome you here and over to you.
Okay, thank you, Manish, and welcome all. Thank you for joining. I'll call it as a good day. I know you're joining from different regions. So today we are here to discuss about a very exciting topic, security for AI. And the reason we want to get into the security aspect of AI is, as you know, 2025 has been called as the Agentic AI year, right? And what it means is that there are, and I'm sure that you are familiar with what Agentic AI is, but just to give you a quick perspective, here we are talking about building multiple agents, and the AI is making a decision which agent to be called at what point of time. Right? That's a very simple definition. So you can imagine that more or less you are leaving the control in the hands of AI to govern the fate of the agents, right? And there's a less human in the loop, more the AI is making the decisions for you. Well, it's just a start, I think, and I think you will agree to that. This is just a start where we see the dependence on human is going to reduce and more autonomous decisions will be made by algorithms which have been trained in certain areas, right? So obviously, if you are in that space, the next question is, well, how are you ensuring that this kind of an operations is following a certain guardrails? So we have seen when internet came in, people were communicating over the internet, and then hence came the cybersecurity aspect of it. Right? People were really scared. How is my information flowing through? How is it secured? Who all have access to that information and whatnot, right? Same repetition of the same thing here. You have a complete transformation of the AI coming in, right? Which is a completely new technology. It is being able to think like human, behave like human, act like human, right? So the question is, what are the guardrails now you have in order to make sure that it is not crossing the boundary? Now, that boundary is a very interesting aspect. And why I say that is basically every country, every geography will have their own definition of the boundary and the guardrails. It's like, for example, today, you will see in the market, there are a few acts which is already in action. Now, when we say in action, they have come up with the acts. The acts has been looked at very closely, but they have not been enforced yet, right? And this is the right time for us to be aware of the various kind of acts today, right? As you know, in UAE, they have appointed a minister, AI minister. So a minister who's be responsible for all the AI usage in the country. So that is even before enforcing any kind of regulations. So UAE Act is one of the primary ones which came into the market, right? And is very well defined in terms of what is high risk, what is medium risk, what is low risk, and how do you actually ensure that you are having proper guidelines and proper compliance in place, right? Followed by that, we'll see the US directive, executive directives and order coming in. Again, we do not have regulations yet, but it's a matter of time, right? You'll have already know about the NIST AI framework that has been there for quite some time. It is more of an AI framework, right? Now the question is, how do you take that and implement that for LLMs, narrow MLs, and any kind of RAGs or agentic AI framework you're coming up with, right? And then UK DORA has been there for a while. It has been more on the data privacy and data security side. Now it has been extended to the AI perspective. And more so as and when these things are getting more and more popular, right? We anticipate there will be a lot of more regulations coming in. Some would be enforced right away, some would be enforced over the period of time as we start learning new things, right? But the whole concept here is there are many regulations already in the market, and each of them talks about very specific areas of AI, right? And more so to come. So with that landscape, right, if you have to really understand, well, what are the AI risks we are talking about, right? And why should we be aware of it, right? Now, it's a very interesting topic that ML or machine learning has been there for quite some time, right? It's nothing new, right? It has been there for last 15, 20 years, if you really look at it. The statistical methods has been there, widely used in various, algorithms. There have been simulation-based algorithms also, right? And that has their own guardrails. And you had, say, for example, if you're generating a random number for any simulations, you'll put a upper bound, lower bound, and try to make sure that you're, following a distribution curve. Similarly, in this aspect of ML, where it was kind of very restrictive in the sense that the predictability of the unknown, right? Or it was more or less very deterministic. What we are saying today is with LLM, the LLM models are in nature is probabilistic or undeterministic. And that leads into a lot of challenges if you have to put it in practice in production environment or in the customer interface environment, right? So you need complete transparency and auditability, right? You need to understand what are the controls you have for bias and fairness. Now, why is it important? For lack of better example, right? If you have a specific model which you're using for, say, screening your candidates for interviews, or you're doing trade approvals, and if you detect biasness over there, right, the company will get sued because of that, right? If it's very evident. Now, how do you prevent that, and how do you know that your model is not biased or is fair, right? Again, these are nothing new concept per se. It has been there for quite some time in the compliance space, but AI enforces a lot of this or resurfaces a lot of this because of the sheer nature of the probabilistic nature of the LLM outputs, right? So I was just checking with my colleague Manish and say, well, Manish, what is the difference between LLM and machine learning, right? Why is so much of a concern? Well, the machine learning has been there for quite some time. Why suddenly people are so worried about the output of the LLM, right? And Manish rightfully said, right? Well, so Joy, there's a lot of things which is not very predictable. Even if it's predictable today, it is not the same outcome you're going to get tomorrow, right? Because by in nature, you're using something which will give you, well, you can set some guardrails. You can say, yes, it should be operating in certain threshold and whatnot. But what happens if it doesn't, right? And that is going to impact and cost a lot of money to the business, right? So AI lifecycle governance and the governance risk and compliance for AI is even more stringent, right? And it's a need of the hour because if you do not have that, I don't think you will be having enough confidence to push this into your production environment, right? Now, the sheer nature of LLM is that, well, when you write a piece of code and you do like your testing and you are like, Six Sigma compliant, this is going to work, right? And 100%, 99.99% is going to work, right? That algorithm has been well tested. And you can sleep in the night when it's running in production. But with LLM, we have to do real-time monitoring. You don't even, it's not possible to do full-fledged testing of the whole model, right? The usage of the models. So the way to prevent this is obviously, yes, you have to do enough testing. But once it's running in the real mode, you have to do real-time monitoring. And what would that real-time monitoring mean, right? Again, you're going to set some guardrails, right, based on how you're using it, right? Based on your use case, based on which geography you're operating, what are the regulations in that particular geography, right? Are you abiding by those? So again, it comes back to the basic principles of GRC. You need to have your controls in place, and you have to constantly monitor your control effectiveness, right? So this is a small quote. GRC is no longer a checklist. We used to use GRC for checking out. Okay, I've had this controls in place, and this is compliant. I'm good. It is actually a compliance which is embedded in AI itself. Now that brings to a very different perspective. You're basically using AI to see how to do GRC for AI, right? And it sounds very weird, but that's exactly how you want to make sure that you're protecting yourself against any kind of toxic outcome of the AI models, right? So Manish, I wanted to just ask you, so far, do you have any questions? And what
Not
do
a
you think?
question, but basically,
Yeah.
I think not a question, but the way I kind of, that was very insightful, Joy. So the way I see is there are three key takeaways when I heard last 5-7 minutes of yours. One is there's an evolving key AI acts and regulations. You spoke about the UAI Act, you spoke about DORA, you spoke about, even Canada is drafting an IDA, which is coming up. And second thing you spoke about is the regulatory expectations on GRC. So there's a lot more demand about the algorithmic transparency, auditability, bias management, fairness, and most importantly, the AI-specific record keeping, because the outcomes could vary, as you rightly said. And the third one that I heard is that there are implications for enterprises. So GRC is no longer a traditional check-in-the-box policy control. It's also about it need to cover the AI model life cycles. So there is the need where this is embedded into your, how AI operates across your enterprise. So those were the three things I kind of am summing it up based on what I heard from your last 5 minutes.
So that's an excellent observation, and thank you for summarizing it. And you're spot on, right? So now the question is, okay, you have the regulations, you have the standards, it's pages and pages of documentation. How much of that is applicable to you, right? And what you should be looking for, right? Now, again, these are basic GRC principles. Again, it is getting followed everywhere in AI. Also, it is applicable. First and foremost, what do you understand by risk? What is AI risk? And what is a taxonomy, right? You have to, as an organization, you have to determine well before you're using the models into production, right? What are the AI risks you should be aware of, right? How do you categorize those in terms of severity and system impact, right? Understand the controls and the mitigation strategy. Again, this is nothing new, but it's very applicable for AI. So once you build that taxonomy and then having that taxonomy in place for the organization, pin to your policy, pin to the regulation and standards is extremely important, right? That itself takes a lot of time and energy. Again, as I said, you're going to use AI to do the governance for AI, right? So here we are, Cygeniq, where we are actually allowing you to build that taxonomy, right? Using Cygeniq product, using a generative AI to build that for you, right? Then comes the governance. Once you have the clearly defined your taxonomy, right? Well, who is the owner of the risk? Which business is using the AI models, right? Having a clear, precise inventory of all the models at any given point in time is extremely important. And more so is the accountability, right? Who makes the decisions if the model is not behaving within the guardrails, and if you have found that certain controls are not adequate, right? Do you take the model offline or do you actually buy insurance for the model, right? So there are a lot of mitigation strategies you have to take, and you have to take business decisions. And hopefully those things you are not going to delegate to AI, because that is where the human is needed to make a decision and find the consequence, right? Then the whole lifecycle management, right? Now, what we are saying is, do not wait for your models to get into production to do your GRC or governance risk and compliance. You should actually start much before while you're building your models. Because if your models are not built in a certain way, and in the development process, if you are not instituting those kind of guardrails, rightfully so, you would get a lot of surprise when you actually start monitoring that into production. So the lifecycle management, right, of AI is extremely important. It starts from development all the way from running it into production, right? And then, of course, if there are incidents happening in production, you have to have a robust incident response team to see what are the incidents you are seeing and how you're going to mitigate those kind of risk, if you will, right? So again, taxonomy definition, governance, lifecycle management, and incident response for any kind of incidents are, again, bread and butter for any GRC, right? And so is for AI, and nothing new over here. but there are certain specificity for the AIs which you have to look for. Right.
Perfect. One question, Joe, if I may ask, and I'm just putting myself in a customer's shoes. So imagine I'm a large enterprise and I have tens and hundreds of vendor partner ecosystem. And while I may have some form of an AI risk governance and control, my partners and vendors don't. In that case, what is the third party or a vendor AI risk and how we can literally look in that aspect?
So that's an excellent question. And I don't know whether you're reading my mind or have read my slides, but that's the next piece. Next piece we talk about is a third-party risk, right? So the third-party element here, it's actually, if you look at the OASP standards, one of them is supply chain. It talks about supply chain risk, right? So if you're using, any company which is upstream or downstream, which is actually using AI, LLM-based models, right? You have to understand what are the guardrails for those, right? Because you will be interfacing with those agents, for lack of better words, right? So it's very critical that when you do this assessment, right, the third-party assessment, one of the section would be now, what is your AI risk? How are you going to, mitigate that? First of all, you have to identify that, define your, the control structures, right? So it's critical, but more so if you are proactive, if you're doing this upfront, then less of a surprise you get later on, right? So third-party risk management is extremely important, and it gets very complicated. Even though we call it third-party, it can be fourth-party supplier to a supplier, and it can go on, right? So it doesn't end, in that respect. And there's a lot of cascading risk because of that, right? So one thing we have learned in unlike other GRC areas that in AI, it is not possible to do testing or if you're doing a risk management in a manual way. Yes, human needs to be in the loop, but there has to be a continuous check running somewhere, right? Which is your control testing running somewhere. You're doing your risk assessments in a continuum basis. It's a more real-time need, right? Rather than saying that, well, I'll do it at a point in time. Because if you do it in point in time, next minute it can become obsolete, right? Again, LLMs are using weights, LLM are using bias, LLM are using neural nets, right? LLM are using hidden layers, right? So the question is if those layers, those weights, and those biases are being affected by doing more and more inferences, then the question is then, well, you start from a certain point and you're soon going to start drifting, which is called the model drifting in AI, right? And then you have to put a guardrail somewhere and say, well, if you drift over 20%, over 30%, now I have to recalibrate and bring you back to a certain point, right? So that's the interesting piece where the whole automation has to come in, right? And in order to bring in automation again, it is, yes, you need human in the loop, but it has to be machines checking the machine, how they're working, right? So it's kind of a little bit of an AGI concept here, but then the question here is that, well, it is not possible to do it manually, right? Now, things like bias, ethical standards, ethical compliance, right? These are not an option anymore. Any AI model you have to test this, right? And and I'll come to that, there are a series of other metrics you have to be watchful about, right? But educating yourself, understanding the consequence of this is most important thing, right? While you're building these models, right? So, the time to operationalize AI risk is now. You cannot wait for the model to go into production, right? You cannot wait for a failure because if the failure happens, it's going to be very expensive in terms of fines and in terms of losing your business and your reputation, right? So you cannot wait for a first incident to happen and then go for GRC for AI, right? That's the whole concept of how proactively can you actually react to those kind of situations, and you're well prepared before any kind of event happens, right? So it's kind of in cyber, risk. You have playbooks, which has been very well defined. Here, the same concept comes in. Well, how are you going to mitigate the risk once you identify the risk, right?
Perfect. So if I just kind of sum it up, I think the way I heard is as AI is becoming very critical to decision making, I think there's a need for organizations to reframe their GRC, comply to the new AI standards, new taxonomies to lifecycle governance to third-party oversight, and have proactive controls and accountability in the place today, not waiting for their first incident to happen.
That's exactly right, right? So now let me quickly introduce you to Cygeniq. And Cygeniq is a company which is a generative AI company, right? Our mission is to protect any kind of AI solutions you have, right? It's a startup company. We have done many years of research now as LLMs were getting popular, as generative AI was getting popular, right? We wore the security hat and said, well, let us look at from the security lens. We saw a lot of similarity with cybersecurity and AI security, right? So it's a lot of this concepts you'll see that will actually it has been built into the product itself. And what we say is we are security for AI and AI for security, right? So we are also using, we have a product called CyberTiX, which also uses AI to do the cybersecurity monitoring, right? So there are three products, Hexashield AI, GRCortex AI, and CyberTiX AI. Today we will cover Hexashield and GRCortex, right? We will keep cyber for another day. So the way we build our platform, right? Again, this is it's a platform, and we have built multiple products on the platform. So our platform is powered by Cygeniq, right? CY is cyber, Gen is generative AI, right? And Q is quantum. Okay. So obviously, as you can see, that we are preparing ourselves for the security for the quantum computing also, right? So Hexashield today is a red teaming platform. Now the red teaming is a cyber concept, right? You have team of people who will try to break the models in development or in production, right? So the idea here is that, well, once you are being able to break the models, meaning that you have set certain guardrails and the models are not behaving within the guardrails, right? Or the model is giving you some biased output, or is it giving you toxic output, or the output of the model is not fair, right? So how do you detect those, right? And you have team of people who can actually do that. But what we are proposing is instead of people doing it, we have Hexashield AI, which will constantly do it for you. And you can select like what are the kinds of scenarios you want to run, right? And based on that, it will give you a risk score. So that is our Hexashield AI in a nutshell. We have GRCortex, which is a GRC platform for AI. Now, as we talked about the regulations, the standards, we talked about defining your policies, you have to define your requirements, your control objectives, and your controls, right? And then eventually you have to define your questionnaires, right? So all of this, right, if you look at it, it's very applicable to AI, right? So what we provide in GRCortex is it's a basically it gives you the policies out of the box, it gives you the requirement, and you can actually fine tune it, right, based on your needs. But all these policies, controls, objectives are again generated using generative AI, right? And then you can actually do your correlation analysis, and you can actually start doing your control testing. So that's what GRCortex is, and we will get a quick glimpse of that. And finally, we have the third product, which we are not going to go in today. It is basically how to use generative AI for cybersecurity, specifically for threat intelligence. Right? So let's look at a little bit of deep dive of what does red teaming mean. So in order to do the red teaming, you eventually have to have your models against which you are going to do the red teaming. So, we either you can have your own model registry, or our product can actually scan your MLOps and figure out what are the models are getting used, right? Then we look at, well, what are the explainability and transparency you have. So when we are running a set of scenarios against your model, we want to actually show you how your model behaves, right? These scenarios are again very well crafted, right? Which is called the adversarial attack generation. It is again our many years of our research papers, right, where we have gone into the specificity of the industry with the geography, and they say, well, these are the typical scenarios you want to be aware of. And once you run these scenarios on a continuum basis, it is going to give you a risk score, right? And you can actually go and now see whether how much vulnerability do you see upfront, right, with the models? Now, again, this is all happening on a continuum basis. Human is not running it. You schedule it at whatever frequency you want to, right? And it eventually gives you the whole breakdown all the way from model discovery to how the model is behaving against certain adversarial conditions, right? So that is our Hexashield in a nutshell, right? And if you get into a little bit of details of, well, what are the kind of risk we are looking at, right? Now, as you know, that OASP has come up with the top 10 uh, risk categories for LLM. It has also run for machine learning, and this is the LLM ones we see on the left-hand side, right? It gives you from 1 to 10. These are the 10 risk categories you should be worried about. And on the right-hand side, again, this is where we come in, right? We have been able to define which we call a level 0 and level 1 metrics, right? And these level 0, level 1 metrics are mapped to your risk categories. And the circle you're seeing in the middle is basically showing how you can map, say, for example, prompt injection to toxicity or to privacy or to robustness, right? And then again, you have detailed test scenarios against each of these level 1 metrics, which you're going to run in a periodic way to figure out what your risk scores are. And this risk scores gets aggregated at the business unit level, at the model level. You can actually set certain thresholds. If you cross certain thresholds, it's actually going to create issues for you. And that issues, you can actually manage it in the platform itself. So our definition, which is kind of interesting, when we say that Red Teamer is using this Hexashield platform, they are here to break your models, not to say their model is working fine, right? So it's basically the way we look at it is the Hexashield AI, the usage is really justified when you're being able to break the models, right? And what we are seeing today is that we have reached a certain maturity here, right, with our own LLM to not only generate the test scenarios, but also execute the test scenarios and see how toxic or how fair is the model's response is going to be, right? So, Manish, any questions and any observations so far, or anything
I
from the
think,
audience?
yeah, I mean, I'll first ask audience if they have any question, feel free to put it in a chat. Happy to rephrase it. I do have one question, and this is something I learned when I've been using so many different, the Gen AI agents. So, for example, when I use a Gen AI agent which is built and developed in North America versus one that's done in Southeast Asia, same prompt gives very different outcomes. And the reason being is probably somewhere there is a biasness, there is something that comes into the play. So when I was watching if you go back to the previous slide, those 10 parameters on the left and those 4 categories on the right, I think this is what I'm hearing from my client is becoming a challenge on the effective, those AI tool adoption. Is there any piece of advice when I look at these 4 categories on the matrix on the right, like which one to target first when somebody is considering a leading AI agent implementation in their enterprises?
That's an excellent question. And we also provide the AI advisory, right? Where, and unfortunately, there's no one size fits all, right? It will, as you rightly said, depends on which geography you're operating, right? In some cases, biasness may be lower risk compared to toxicity or fairness, right? In terms of which industry you're operating in, right? And that is why we introduce the concept threshold. The threshold can be different for different organization or different, geography, right? And we will propose a certain threshold. But as and when we are testing your models, if it crosses certain threshold, which is again set by you, right? We will identify those as a high risk, medium risk, or low risk, right? And that's how you can view it, right? So I think the best approach here is to sit with you, understand your landscape, where are you using LLM, what are your use cases, right? And then we will provide you a kind of a playbook that, well, these are the scenarios you should probably run it on a frequent basis. And by the way, you can also define your own scenarios, right? We give you the flexibility to define your own scenarios because that's extremely important, right? Because who knows best about your business? It's you, not us, right? So in that case, basically, we allow you, we'll tell you that this is how to build the scenarios, and we are going to give you a catalog of scenarios out of the box. You can clone them, you can modify it, you can actually add more to it. But then the whole, the art behind this is executing that and coming up with a risk score and then showing you in a glance that, well, this business units are using these models, and these three models are high risk and four are low risk based on our today's assessment, right? And as I said before, you can continuously run this, right? So unfortunately, there's not one answer say that, well, do all this four and you can sleep in the night, right? That depends on, again, the use case. Right? I hope I answered your question.
You did. Thank you.
Okay. So quickly, I don't want to take a lot of time on this slide, but the whole important point here is that Cygeniq comes with a library of test scenarios, right, for industry, for geography, right? And we give you the same agents to build your test scenarios if you want, right? And you can also modify the Cygeniq test scenarios to suit it for your adaptability. We have our risk scoring methodology, right, which actually tells you for each scenario you run against your model, how does your risk score look like? And that's your starting point, because if the risk score is crossing your set threshold, then we will actually generate issues for you, which you can manage it in a later time, right? Now, the whole idea here is that it is a continuum process. It cannot be one time, right? And the adversarial prompt generation is also not static, right? You can keep generating more and more prompts, again, based on your use cases, right? So this whole idea here is that the advisory which we provide as a service, right, helps you to build those catalog of test scenarios. And again, as you build more and more models, as you build more and more agents, right, as Manishi pointed out, right, there would be a variability of that, and you have to build this catalog on a continuum basis, and that is where we bring in our expertise, right? Okay. So our idea is to have a 360-degree coverage, right, which is very important, as accurate it can be, and that would definitely increase your productivity, right, and allow you to use your models in a more efficient way. Now, we also touched upon a very important topic, right? Don't wait for your model to be in production, right? You should start injecting these whole principles while you're building it out in your DevSecOps, pipeline itself, right? The other day I was listening to one of the podcasts where they were talking about, zero distance availability, right? So it's one of the famous company. They're talking about, hey, how do you actually make sure that whatever equipments you're using is actually like zero distance? There's no distance between any of the, how we are communicating today, right? So the concept of this kind of it's the same thing here. You have to be very proactive on day one, right? The distance between your GRC platform of AI and your development should be reduced ASAP, right? Because if you do not have the guardrails, if you do not understand what the guardrails should be, there's not a good scenario to be when you're in production and detecting those kind of issues. So while you're building your inventory, while you're doing your build of your models, you should do red teaming of your models. You should address the guardrail issues, right? And do that in a much more continuum basis. So that is why we are saying that Hexashield not only can be used in post-production, right, or in production, it can be and should be used while you're in the build phase itself, right? And build it into your pipeline like you do your unit testing, system testing, regression testing. You should do your red teaming testing also within your MLOps pipeline. Manish, I'll take a pause before we go to GRCortex. Is there any other questions you are seeing today?
No, I think what I saw there was a suggestion from one of our listeners. So I think the comment is absolutely correct that most of the AI system risk is from the quality of data. So what we feed in is what you get out. And I think there are ways how the various data inputs can and the test scenarios will help to kind of mature it. So that was one, I would say, comment rather than a question that I see on a group chat.
So, and my reaction to the comment is yes and no, right? So if you look at, I'll do a quiz, right? Manish, I'm sorry, I did not tell you. I'll do a quiz. What is the most frequent letter out of the 26 which is used?
I know the answer, but I don't know.
So there is a statistical way of saying, well, these are the most frequent letters being used, right? In a letter of 26, right? And the answer is E. Okay, by the way, right? So there's a whole concept of being statistically proving that, well, this will work, right? Versus LLM is very good at, it's non-deterministic, right? It is probabilistic. It's trying to guess your next word. right? In a simply put, right? And the guessing of the next word obviously comes with a lot of trainings, and depending on the parameters and how many parameters you have and how you train your parameters and whatnot, right? But there are too many hyperparameters you can modify to get different answers, right? And that's the beauty of the LLM. So it is not that straightforward that, well, obviously, if you keep your temperature one, then you're going to get always the same answer, right? And that also is there. But if you reduce your temperature, right, you will see that the variability are there, right? So the question here is that, well, are you going to get the same answer every time? The answer is no. So if your training data set was the same and you had the same LLM and you keep asking the same question, you may not get the same answer. And that's the beauty of the LLM. And that's the power of the LLM, right? So it is actually, there's a lot of art behind it, right? How it comes up with different words and different probabilistic nature of the words determining all of that. So training data is very important, but you cannot just rely on your training data and say, well, if I give this training data to Llama 7B model, I will always get the same response when I give this prompt. Unfortunately, that is not the case of LLM, right? So that is why you really have to test at different levels. You have to test the output, the final output, and you have to gain confidence in the final output. Unfortunately, you cannot write 1 or 3 test cases and say, hey, I'm good. There has to be millions and millions of test cases running against your LLM to understand even where you stand in terms of the whole perspective of the whole landscape, right? That is why it becomes a much more challenging. And again, you cannot have 100% coverage, but you can set your level of confidence where you want to ensure that, well, at a certain level, you're going to make this acceptable, right? So training data is important, but you got to test LLMs in the real life, and you have to continue the testing in a real life. You cannot do a point in time, right?
Perfect. Amazing. There is a question on the group chat, but I'm thinking probably I'll take this after the GRCortex AI. So we will go through that.
Yeah, sure. So GRCortex AI is a second product which we have. Now you can see that it actually ties to each other, and I'll show how it ties back to each other, right? So we talked about the building of the AI governance framework. Again, we have the advisory to help you out to build the AI governance framework, right? Which will define what your taxonomy is, how you're mapping the standard taxonomy to your company taxonomy. It will help you to build your policies, it will tell you how your policies map to your standards or the regulations, right? It will also help you to build out your control effectiveness or your control objectives. You can define your requirements. So that's our governance framework, which is very important and which you have to define. Again, you have to define it while you're building the model, not after going into production, right? And then basically you're talking about various kind of metrics, right? Which is basically nothing but your risk and controls, right? What are the risks you're identifying, which is very specialized for your area of business, right? As I said, like biasness may not be that critical, but your toxicity may be more critical, right? Based on a use case, right? And then based on that, you are going to now say, well, what is my control framework going to look like, right? So you have to define your control framework. So again, these are all of this we have advisory, and we have the experts who has done this. We're doing this on a day-to-day basis. We also bring in the whole knowledge of comparing between different sectors and different geography also, right? To help you out that, well, your competitors are doing this way. You should be looking at certain specific way without disclosing any of the confidential information, right? So again, as I'm rolling through this, you can see that, well, this is very specific to AI. We have obviously a scoring algorithm, right, to determine how your model is doing. You have the model lifecycle management. You have the full transparency in terms of how the score is being derived, right? And then the other important thing is the cross model governance, right? Because most of the time, and this is as you go into AGI, you'll see a lot more of this, but agents are actually going towards that. There is a whole interoperability between the models, right? When a model starts talking to another model without the human in the loop, it gets even interesting. And that's why we will see that in more and more coming into agentic. And that may be 2026 kind of a era, right? But cross-model governance is extremely important, right? And then basically you have to also say, well, in which case, what model to use and what use case you want to use what models, right? Understanding that is also very important. So overall, net, basically our platform allows you to have a full-fledged governance of the AI use cases, and your AI models. So as we said, right, we talk about the model registry, right? Again, we have the auto discovery feature. You can go ahead and invoke that. It'll look into your MLOps, discover the models. You have the full transparency in terms of how your adversarial prompts are getting tested and what is the outcome you're getting, right? In case your risk score is not meeting the threshold, then obviously you will have issues generated, and then you have to do a mitigation of those issues, right? The risk management model is purely, from the GRC perspective, you can define your own risk. You can define it in your risk registry. You can map it to your control effectiveness, right? And you can eventually decide on which are the ones which is more critical versus less critical for you to take actions, right? Compliance effectiveness is very important. That is very tied to your controls, what controls you have set today, right? Based on your policy standards, your regulations, right? And then you're continuously testing that. So this is a very important piece for us because as we said before, that you cannot do control testing manually in AI because it is very cumbersome, right? So this is where we draw the connection between GRCortex and Hexashield, wherein Hexashield is a red teaming platform, but is actually, you can look at it as a control testing platform also, automated control testing platform, right? So if you link those between GRCortex and Hexashield, you can define certain controls which you will be running in an automated way, right? And the risk scoring for that is also done through Hexashield, which will bring it back to your GRCortex. Right. Obviously, the reporting and the management is very important for any GRC platform. So basically, that's where our GRCortex offering is, right, in terms of giving you all the way from helping you to define your policies, coming up with your requirements and control objectives, your risk registers, right, and managing your risk effectively on a continuum basis. And this is very important because this is something where AI begs it, right? That it cannot be a one-time risk assessment you do or self-risk assessment you do, and you can say, well, my models are all compliant, I'm good with it, right? This is a continuous process. So our dashboards and all is everything is real time. It does it on a real-time basis for you. So that's from our presentation point of view, and I'm happy to take on any questions.
Thanks, Charles. I think this was a very helpful session. So now we are open for Q&A, and I encourage the audience to ask any questions they may have, either whether it's AI regulation, risk and integration strategy, or any real-time problem that you are facing today within your organization. I did see a poll which is up on the chat where I'm seeing roughly about 41% people are just getting started and roughly 33 are in the early adoption, except one vote that says they are midway with the policies. So I think depending on where you are in the journey, feel free to bring this question forward. That being said, I do see one question here, and that question is, what are some common blind spots in AI risk assessment that organizations often overlook?
So that's an excellent question, right? You're always worried about the unknowns, right? So the question here is that, well, how do you know that you have covered your bases, right? Now, any kind of qualitative risk management, right? This problem remains, right? What are my risk I should be monitored? How should my risk register look like? And am I monitoring the right ones or not, right? So the variability here is on one side you have the standards and the regulations and the frameworks, right? So the NIST is a framework and a UA Act is a regulation, right? So if you are compliant to certain frameworks and certain standards, most likely that you are covering most of your bases, right? But the challenge here is that you also have to ensure that you are looking through the lens of your organization. How are you using the models, right? And you would be the better judge in terms of how did you do your fine-tuning of the models, for example, right? Or the different agents you have written, right? Or the functions you've written for the agents, right? How have we tested those, right? So I think the answer is twofold. One is to obviously take help of the standards and the regulations. Other thing is to understand and do a self-discovery, right? Which is called a self-assessment, self-risk assessment, right? Understand the business impact, right? If the model doesn't behave in a certain way, what are your business impact, right? And that kind of thing, along with our advisory services, will actually help you to kind of come up with the set of controls you need to have. Which of these controls needs to be monitored in an automated way? If there's a control failure, then what are the actions you should take? And how does your AI risk look like in a given point of time? Which ones you should be worried about, which one you should not be worried about. So it's a discussion, it's a joint responsibility, right? There will be no such product in the market which will say, oh, okay, if you do use that, then you will never have any problem with LLMs. That's not the idea. The idea here is to do a discovery with you and to give you the level of comfort that, okay, what you cannot do manually today, it can be done by the generative AI models itself. Sorry, it was a long-winded answer.
No, I think that's well deserved because this is evolving, so it has to be explained bit by bit for audience to relate to it. Are there any more questions from anybody? Please feel free to put on the chat window. And while you're putting your questions, I think I will highly recommend you to visit our website, Cygeniq AI. I mean, today, for a purpose, we did not give a glimpse of our products because we realized it's an IP, we didn't want to go out. But that being said, if somebody wants to book a private consultation or wants to have an early preview of what our product look like, happy to do so. So I'll wait for 5 more seconds. If I don't see any question, then I have one question which I'll ask myself.
Okay, please.
Cool. I know this question had come up 6 weeks ago also when we were unveiling Cygeniq to the world. And the question back then was, can Cygeniq products like Hexashield and GRCortex, can they integrate with the existing enterprise platform?
So that's an excellent question, right? So in today's world, right, as and when we are seeing products are getting built out, right? I'll give you a classic example, right? We do not want to build a reporting platform, right? So any organization will have their ways of reporting, say, different kinds of risk, right? Maybe an operation risk or enterprise risk or third-party risk, right? Which is non-related to AI, right? And you want to collect those information together and give a holistic dashboard to your CXOs. Yes. So the way to do that is basically you have the connectors, right? And you can actually export your data set, right? And you can do very nice reporting using any of the BI tools today. But we do come out of the box reports, but that may not be enough, and you want to do fine tuning of that, right? So the connectors allows you to actually operate all of these functions of the product using REST APIs, bringing in your data and taking your data out, right? So it is a piece of a puzzle in a whole ecosystem if we have multiple GRC platforms, for example, today, right? You can easily bring in your risk, which are associated to AI, into a platform, right? And then you can start monitoring those. If you have a control library, you can bring in a control library. If you have assets which you want to do auto discovery on, you can connect our product to the asset inventory, right? So it's basically you have the connectors and the REST APIs, which will allows you to fit in this into any landscape you want.
Perfect. Thanks, Joy. So I don't see any more questions. So thank you all for joining us. Just to sum it up, if you are evaluating how to take a step forward in securing your AI investments and how to make the best use of GRCortex and Hexashield, feel free to reach out. I put up the chat window. On the chat. Actually, there is one more question, so let me take a pause there. So the question is, as the AI governance evolves over time, are your products designed to help organizations keep up and stay aligned?
Absolutely, and that is where we introduced the Cygeniq platform concept, right? So we are not a point solution player, right? This is a platform which has been built out. Just to give you an example, right? Any of the, the GRC domain objects you have, right? So policy, standards, regulations, controls, control effectiveness, or for that matter, your adversarial test scenarios and how you execute your test scenarios, you can define your own custom metrics, right? So we have given the full flexibility that whatever comes out of the box, if it doesn't meet your requirements, you can do the same functions. You can actually do, you can bring in your standards, you can bring in your policies, you can bring in your controls if you want, right, into the platform and start using it. And as and when this various regulations are changing, our advisory group actually monitors those, right, and keeps updating our Cygeniq library of controls, Cygeniq library of the adversarial test scenarios, Cygeniq library of the metrics, right? So today we have out of the box 48 metrics to be monitored, and tomorrow there may be some more coming in. So that's how we have built the platform. It's a complete SaaS play. Right. So as and when things are coming up, we are filling in the content of the product so that you can actually make use of it.
Perfect. Thank you. So now we are right on the time. So that being said, I want to thank again for everybody for joining us. Stay tuned for our next webinar, which I think you heard briefly from Joy. We are introducing our AI advisory services. So we will be here with our next guest speaker, and I'll be there again as well to help you. So thank you once again, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you, and take care.